Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're tackling one of the absolute most fascinating and honestly fiercely debated questions in all of biblical scholarship. We're looking at the history of the Old Testament. But we aren't just looking at what the text says, we're looking at how it actually came together in the first place, and more importantly, when. This is the Great Canon debate, a massive scholarly showdown between the idea of a fixed, closed collection and a fluid, evolving one.
It's a question that feels like it should have a super straightforward answer, right? When was the Old Testament finished? But the truth is, the answer is way more complicated and messy than a leather-bound book just dropping out of the sky fully formed. How we answer this question fundamentally changes how we view the entire history of these ancient texts.
To get through this, here's our agenda for today's debate. We've got 1. The Great Canon debate. 2. The case for early closure. 3. McDonald's challenge to the evidence. 4. Evidence from scrolls and rabbis. 5. Defining Scripture versus canon. And finally, 6. A fluid conclusion.
So let's kick things off with Section 1, the Great Canon debate.
In one corner of this scholarly ring, we have the traditional status quo view, heavily championed by scholars F. Bruce and Roger Beckwith. They basically view the Old Testament canon as a fixed early box, meaning the limits of the Hebrew Bible were rigid and settled very, very early on. On the opposing side, acting as our challenger today, is scholar Lee Martin McDonald. Now, while he absolutely respects their massive contributions, McDonald argues that their conclusions just don't hold up to modern scrutiny. He sees the Old Testament text not as a rigid fixed box, but as a fluid, late river that continued to actively evolve long after the time of Jesus.
Let's move to and see how this builds across the historical timeline. There are 3 critical stops we're going to be arguing over today. First, 1640 BC, which is the time of Judas Maccabeus. Second, the 1st century AD, the era of Jesus and the early church. And third, the 2nd to 4th century AD, the period of later rabbinic consensus. The entire debate really hinges on which of these eras actually locked the biblical texts into place.
Moving right along to Section 2, the case for early closure from Bruce and Beckwith.
Bruce and Beckwith's fundamental argument is that the Hebrew Bible was essentially a done deal well before the Christian era. Beckwith points specifically to the year 164 BC. Relying on a passage in the book of 2 Maccabees, he posits that the Jewish leader Judas Maccabeus formally closed the canon by collecting the scriptures right after the severe Antiochene persecution. So, in this specific scholarly view, the 3-part division of law, prophets, and writings was locked in centuries before the New Testament even began. And to back this up, they point to a brilliant illustration from the New Testament itself, or at least, so they argue. Bruce and Beckwith highlight a quote where Jesus refers to all the righteous bloodshed from Abel to Zechariah. They argue Abel is in Genesis, the first book, and Zechariah is in Chronicles, the last book of the Hebrew Bible. So Jesus is clearly acknowledging a fixed, closed bookend from Genesis to Chronicles, right? Well, McDonald counters that this isn't a fixed book list at all. It's simply a reference to the chronological history of Israel's martyrs. It's about time, not a table of contents.
That brings us to Section 3, McDonald challenges the evidence. Time for the cross-examination. Remember that 164 BC date based on 2 Maccabees? Yeah, McDonald objects to this entirely. He points out that reading this text as some official canonization event is incredibly unnatural. Look at the historical context here. The people had just been through a devastating war and persecution. What 2 Maccabees actually describes is a desperate, fast-paced post-war salvage operation of archival materials from the rubble. It is literally not some formal ecclesiastical council calmly deciding the limits of the biblical canon. There's simply zero corroborating evidence for a canonization process happening during that period.
McDonald also rigorously cross-examines how the early closure camp handles, well, inconvenient texts. For instance, the New Testament author Jude directly and enthusiastically cites a non-canonical book, 1 Enoch. Because Beckwith already firmly believes the canon was closed by this time, he attempts to explain this away by claiming Jude just found 1 Enoch edifying, but didn't actually view it as inspired scripture. McDonald's response to this is incredibly sharp. He calls it special pleading. Treat this like a dramatic courtroom objection. McDonald points out that Jude literally claims the figure Enoch prophesied. Think about that. In the 1st century, if you said a writing contained prophecy, you were inherently ascribing divine authority to it. You don't call a text prophecy if you just think it's a nice, edifying read for the weekend. This shows the boundaries of what early believers considered authoritative were much, much broader than Bruce and Beckwith want to admit. Let's head into Section 4, Evidence from Scrolls and Rabbis. This is where we get into the physical evidence.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how stark the contrast is between a theoretical closed box and historical reality. When we actually unearthed the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are literally our absolute best physical evidence of first-century Jewish texts, we didn't find a neat closed canon. We found extreme text fluidity. I mean, there were multiple versions of texts existing right alongside books that never even made it into the final Bible, all seemingly treated with intense reverence. Furthermore, in the 2nd to 4th centuries, rabbis were still fiercely debating which books actually belonged in the collection. Think about the profound irony here. If Judas Maccabeus settled this all the way back in 164 BC, why on earth were the leading rabbis passionately arguing about it hundreds of years later?
So let's summarize McDonald's definitive knockout blow here. First, there is zero hard evidence of closure in the 1st century. Second, the Dead Sea Scrolls absolutely prove textual fluidity at the turn of the era. Third, those fierce rabbinic disputes prove the debate raged well into the 4th century. Therefore, Bruce and Beckwith made a massive historical error. They mistakenly took the later rabbinic consensus that happened centuries after Jesus, and they anachronistically pasted it backwards onto the 1st century.
And that takes us to Section 5, Defining Scripture versus Canon, a really crucial distinction.
The fatal flaw in the early closure theory is conflating two completely different concepts. McDonald insists we absolutely must have a sharp distinction here. First, he defines Canon 1, which is simply Scripture. This is any written text functioning with religious and divine authority for a community. And the reality is, in the 1st century, there were many fluid texts that functioned as Canon 1. They were authoritative, they were cited, they were revered.
This sharply differs from Canon 2, which is the actual canon itself, a fixed, limited, and strictly closed collection. So the crucial point is that Bruce and Beckwith saw 1st century authors citing authoritative texts, Canon 1, and they immediately jumped to the conclusion that a closed list, Canon 2, already existed. McDonald proves that while many texts were absolutely authoritative in the 1st century, the door was not closed yet. Not by a long shot.
Finally, Section 6, a fluid conclusion. Let's get to the final verdict.
McDonald's ultimate conclusion is a highly respectful but totally firm correction of his peers. Bruce and Beckwith were simply too eager to find a perfectly settled Bible during the time of Jesus. To get there, they had to rely heavily on arguments from silence, totally ignore the messy, fluid reality of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and read history completely backwards. The historical evidence strongly points to a collection that remained a fluid, evolving river well into the early centuries of the Common Era.
I want to leave you with this provocative thought to ponder. We often want our history to be incredibly neat and tidy, a fixed box perfectly passed down through the ages. But the evidence actually shows a messy, human, and fiercely debated process. If the biblical text was a fluid river rather than a fixed box for centuries, how does that change the way we read, understand, and appreciate it today? It certainly makes the history behind the pages a whole lot more fascinating. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.